And so we will begin. I'm just really delighted to see all of your faces again. I know you might not recognize this, but I had been in Canada for the last 3 months, and I just felt really far away from Europe. So now that I'm back, it's just so nice to feel like I'm back, and you're all part of being back. So this is also a second part to our conversation that we started before the summer break, and I'm really looking forward to what our three speakers have to say today, and then the questions that come from that. I'll remind you that this session is being recorded, and if there is a difficulty for that, you can send a message to Emily. But this will be recorded. I will just read the preamble that was sent out with this. Just so that we have a good idea again of what we'll be talking about tonight, and then I'll pray and introduce our speakers, and then they can take it from there. So polarization creates an us versus them dynamic, which does not exist outside the church alone. As Christians, we don't always agree on many topics. Are we contributing to the tension and polarization, or are we actively carving out spaces for open conversation? How do we relate to the others in our community and to those with different beliefs and faiths? So each one of our speakers this afternoon will be talking about the challenges of navigating these three big polarizing topics: the freedom of speech, migrants and refugees, and human sexuality. So let's just start with prayer, and then I'll introduce our three speakers. Father, thank you so much for this moment that we have to talk about issues that are close to your heart. We want to be a church that is full of love and grace, truth and justice. And maneuvering those concepts is not as easy as it is to say. And so tonight we pray as we listen that you will touch our hearts. We pray for our speakers that you will give them complete freedom to say what they need to say, and then stimulate us with good questions that will help us to move forward, to do good practice, and to think clearly about these issues. We pray this in Jesus' name, that you get all the honor and glory. Amen. Our first speaker this afternoon will be Nancy Lefevre, and she will be speaking on the freedom of speech. Nancy is an international business law graduate in France and in the US. She first worked as an in-house lawyer for the HSBC in Paris, practicing business and intellectual property law. Since 2010, Nancy has been the lawyer of the National Council of French Evangelical Christians. She advises churches, Christian NGOs, and the CNEF on private law, as well as human rights issues. Nancy specialized in the defense of freedoms of religion and expression, in particular with the Libre de Dire campaign. And since November of 2017, she is a president of Advocates France, Juristes et Chrétiens, a network of Christian lawyers in France. She lives near Montpellier, south of France. She's married and she's a mother of 5 children. Thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us, and we hand over this section to you.
Well, thank you, Connie, and it's really an honor to be with you with such an European panel and this evening. Of course, the topic is very strategic and very broad. So in 15 minutes, we will try just to outline some of the issues that are at stake for us as citizens of Europe and as Christians, of course. So Emily, I don't know if you can put the slides on. Of course, freedom of expression in a polarized society is really something we have to think about as Christians. To start with, of course, freedom of expression is one of our dear and precious right. You know, it has been hardly won through history, so it's not something that that must be taken for granted. It is also protected by all the major human rights treaties as of today. And it's the government that has to ensure that citizens can freely express themselves in public and also in the private sphere. It is said that it's really the foundation of democracy. If you cannot express freely your opinion, then you cannot really have the free market of ideas and then democracy that comes with it, especially with political ideas. So it's really one of the fundamental rights of human rights. It's really something really important. And as European, I mean, most of us would be covered by the European Convention of Human Rights, and it's the Article 10 that really is the better definition that we have now on freedom of expression. And maybe just to recap on the legal aspect, most of the treaties will read like that. You have the principle of freedom of expression or of speech, and then you have the limitations that are legal and that can be accepted. So maybe we have to read together at least Article 10 of the Convention on Human Rights, because it sets the scene for us. So first paragraph reads, everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. This article shall not prevent states from requiring the licensing of broadcasting, television, or cinema enterprise. And second paragraph, the exercise of these freedoms, since it carries with it duties and responsibilities, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions, and penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security, territorial integrity, or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection or reputation of rights of others, for preventing the disclosure or of information received in confidence, or for maintaining the authority or impartiality of the judiciary. So as you see, the principle is really, total, full and total freedom. And of course, there are some restrictions. You may have recognized what's about copyright and reputation, limits on defamation, and so on. And what's also very important is the case law we have from European Court of Human Rights that also say that our freedom extends also to the right to offend people, to disturb other people with our opinions, and to even to shock them. And it's the case of Handyside versus UK, because we need some pluralism. We need some debate, some broad-mindedness for democracy. So as long as you express yourself and you are not provoking hatred and violence, then you can be free to express yourself. And on some sensitive issues, that's really what will be the point of attention. So there are, of course, limits that we know, secrecy, judiciary, and so on. But for in our polarized society, it's really the issue will really turn around some sensitive issues and how we can make the difference between what can just offend, shock people, maybe disturb them, and what will provoke hatred, violence, and actual facts and public disorder. So you can move to the next slide. So what I want to outline today is with that legal framework, we have freedom on the principle, we have some limitation that are that must be also that are restricted by law. They must be necessary, as you heard, they must be necessary for a democratic society. But today we have some very worrying trends that are limiting freedom of expression, and we have to be very cautious about that. I would say we have the proliferation of regulation limiting freedom of expression in a vague and arbitrary way. We have on a legal basis in many of our countries some new articles or some amendment of articles of criminal code that extend limitation of free speech, and they might be called hate speech law, or it might be some protected zone, some blasphemy law, conversion therapy ban. But the trend is that this criminal statute will be really written in a very broad way, so that every person who feels victim, who feel maybe hurt by the speech, could be entitled to go into criminal proceeding. And this is really something that we have to be careful about. I would say especially what's about hate speech law. What's the difference between reinciting to hatred and violent acts and just criticizing some opinions or some groups or some facts? And today the frontier is a bit vague. Protected zone, maybe I know in France some areas around schools where you are not allowed to speak about some different topics. So that's an issue. And also, of course, blasphemy law is the critique of religion or of God, and conversion therapy ban is about what you can say to some people about sexual orientation or gender identity. And as of today, the criminal code can be written in a very broad way, and so that leads to some insecurity about freedom of speech, and also the fact that it can be very arbitrary on the part of the judiciary or the police when they go on such cases. In the end, it affects us because there is a chilling effect on sensitive issues, because the citizen doesn't really know if it can be prosecuted for what he has said or not. Then he will, of course, choose security and not risk. And so this is the effect of self-censorship that comes with this worrying legal trends. So I pinpoint some issues like critique of religion, ethical issues on life, end of life, abortion, sexual life, sexuality, family. All those sensitive issues today are coming in that zone where you cannot say if you are under hate speech law or not, or if someone can raise the fact that you are homophobic or that you are xenophobic, or so it gives some really legal uncertainty with a very strong chilling effect. The use of technology also on all the internet and social media in a globalized world tend to restrict freedom of speech. For a very funny example, the painting of Gustave Courbet, The Origin of the World, which is a naked woman. A few years ago, the algorithm of some social platforms said it was not, it was not allowed. So the distinction between what's illegal nudity and what's art is really an issue. And we see that in this globalized world, the tendency is to restrict to the minimum. And so if maybe your law would be stricter than mine in France, then in a global, with the global social media, the restriction, the highest restriction will be applied. And of course, this use of artificial intelligence in moderating what's the content on internet is a factor of restricting freedom of expression. And that could be for art, but that could be also for Christian views on some very sensitive issues that can be, because of one word, pinpointed as illegal in some place, and so shut down for all the places. We also have, of course, with all this, also a cancel culture. meaning that the media and the public opinion is so quick at finding something unpopular and at just saying that it's not legal. And so the media and the cancel culture is working to restrict freedom of expression of unpopular opinion that may be legal. But in the meantime, you know, the judiciary is and legal decision is taken in a very long time. So you have all the pressure of the media and they are easy to suppress unpopular opinion. Whereas if you bring the case really in the court, eventually you win. And we have several examples of that. In France, for example, for a politician, Christine Boutin, she won on the Cour de Cassation, but in the meantime, of course, her old reputation and what she had said about homosexuality, citing the Bible, was in the mind of the public and the media, what was criminal. We also have the very danger of broad concepts, as I said, homophobia, Islamophobia, Christianophobia as well, that are very dangerous because they embrace kind of everything. They are very vague, and in the end, they are not making the public space secure about what you can say or not. So to conclude, it's a very important topic, and you can change the slide. We have to think about our attitude as Christians. Of course, more freedom of expression is better for everyone. And it's also better for us to spread the gospel, to talk about what God wants for society, and to bless people also with God's promises. And so more freedom of expression is really what we want to advocate and to make for our society. So we have to stay true to our calling. We have to also be blessing among the nations, speak the truth as doves, but also be wise in a wise way as snakes, I would say. Maybe because I'm a lawyer, it's easier for me to talk about that, but we don't have to be naive. We shouldn't be. We have to avoid self-censorship. So this chilling effect, we have to be courageous because we know that we hold some unpopular views. Biblical views have never been very popular, but as to that day, we know that even in Europe and Western Europe, our biblical views are not popular, but we have to avoid to be in self-censorship. When we express unpopular opinion, we really have to care about how we express it. And this is one of the legal counsel I give very often to pastors. You have, when you preach on difficult topics, please be merciful, show the love of God. Even if you talk about sin and speak in word and manners that will help people understand the heart of God and let them listen. And really be not avoid the mindset of speaking about your enemies, and also having a speech that could show that you incite people to reject, to hate, to judge, and to polarize, to make groups. So it's really not the question of what we will say, because we want to be true to the Bible, but how we can say it and how it can be received. Of course, I think we need to defend our freedom of expression when it is attacked in court and in the media. That's very important. This is important, and this is our right. You know that Paul came, he wanted to go to Rome because he had a case and he wanted to use his Roman citizenship to bring his case. So there is, it's also one of, God's way to make his justice be done. So when we are attacked, we need to defend ourselves. And I would say we need to foster a culture of debate, rather than a culture of silence that silence unpopular opinion. So even us, I think, in our midst, or when we organize events, we can also foster the culture of debate, inviting people of other opinion and other ideas to discuss with us, so we can present the gospel and our biblical ideas in a pluralistic environment. And I think that's one of the key also, to be able to respect and to enter into dialogue, and not to be fuel polarization. Of course, when we speak, we have to act with love, and I think that our deeds support our speech. So that's very important, to be coherent in that what we say reflect the love of God, and that we have actual actions of the churches in our countries that show the love of God. And overall, and sometimes it's difficult, we need to support freedom of expression as a precious right for all. It is very difficult also when we are criticized, or when we see maybe under art or publicity or advertisement or other things, when we see, for instance, Jesus Christ depicted in an offensive way for us, it hurts. But we also need to try to understand that we need to defend a broad framework for freedom of expression, and that if we want to also use that as well. So I know the topic is very broad, and some of you are also specialists on that, but this is what was on my heart for this evening and sharing with you. So I'd be happy to discuss that later with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for that. One thing that I forgot to mention is that all of our speakers are delighted to answer questions at the end. So if you would like to now, as we keep the dialogue going, if you want to write questions into the chat, we will deal with those at the end. So it won't be a personal communication between you and Nancy at this point. Just put them in the chat for everyone, and we'll work through them. So at the end, we'll do our best to make sure that everybody's question is answered. But we'll move to our second speaker tonight, and that's Reverend Dr. Israel Oluwe Olofinjana. He says it much more glamorously than I do. He is an ordained and accredited Baptist minister, and has led 2 multi-ethnic Baptist churches and an independent charismatic church. He's the founding director of the Center for Missionaries from the Majority World, an honorary research fellow at the Queen's Foundation for Ecumenical Theological Education in Birmingham, and is on the advisory group on race and theology of the Society for the Study of Theology. Israel is a consultant to Lausanne Europe on the Christian Aid Working Group of Black Majority Church Leaders. He's also a member of the Commission for Mission for the Baptist World Alliance, and lectures at the Christ Theological College on themes related to world Christianity, and is a visiting lecturer at All Nations Christian College and London School of Theology. Israel is married, and he has 2 children, and he's going to be speaking to us tonight about refugees and migrants. Thank you, Israel.
Thank you, Connie, and good evening, everyone. It's 6:28 over here, which I'm sure, I think Connie is very happy about that. It's someone with a different time. I know we are on different time zones, so that's good. Means we are having a pan-European conversation, which is good. Yet, the topic we're looking this evening is sort of on the heavy side, but important for us as leaders to talk about these things. So I'm glad that we are having this conversation. What I want to look about this evening around migration and polarization, I want to look at it in sort of 3 sections, and that is history and polarization around that subject. And then the second is around language and polarization. And then the third one is around the church and polarization. And the previous 2 informs actually they are all integral. So I'm going to be building a picture towards that. And then at the end, I'm going to pose like 2 questions that I think it's important for us to wrestle with And then I'm hoping to close with some reflections that can help us move forward in terms of language. I suppose language is very powerful. And so when we talk about polarization, I think that history around how we see migrants, for me, doesn't start in the migration of people from the majority world to Europe. We have to go back into history. Hence, I'm starting with history and polarization. And I want to take my start from sort of the sort of story around Christopher Columbus, the Italian sort of explorer who went to different parts of the world. Sort of explorer. He was commissioned by Spanish monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, to go and sort of explore. And in his exploration, the kind of language that we talk about in that sense was he discovered the new world. And I think for me, that's the first language of polarization. The language of discovery is very polarizing. And the fact that talking about, because he sort of categorized already that we have someone who is a discoverer and explorer, and then we have people who were discovered, but actually those people already existed. It's just that the West or Europe was not very much aware about their history until they had that contact around the 1400s, because what we now call North America, South America, and the Caribbean, they had their own tribal indigenous people with well sort of structured society and how they do life. But that so-called discovery changed everything totally. And so that's the first thing around history and polarization. And then from there, around the same period, just before even 1492, thereabout, we see that slaves started being transported from around 1444. At least the first set of slaves were transported around 44 to Europe from Africa in that sense. And from there, that led to, the whole discovery, part of what it did. Of course, there's a whole lot of conversation in between going on, led to the need to work the plantations. They need to develop these new lands, these new colonies, or the places that are now being colonized in the Caribbean and United States. We need people to work it. And every suggestion that has led to other people working on it didn't work very well, whether it's the indigenous Americans, didn't last long for various reasons. And then, of course, poor white Europeans who were shipped to the other side of the Atlantic, again, was seen as not enough. So there was the need for a kind of a bigger working force. And as that process continues, slaves, that triangular trade, which we now talk about, transatlantic slave trade, started, which went for hundreds of years. As I said, first set of slaves were transported 1444, and slavery didn't end. Of course, there is the abolition of 1807, but that's not when slavery ended. Slavery ended around the 1860s. And even after that, indentured servitude continued in other contexts. But that whole episode created, again, another polarization, the enslaved and the masters. And so we see again that, history developing, that we have masters and we have the enslaved. Now, take note of the way I'm using the word enslaved. I'm not using slaves, because oftentimes using the word slave sometimes sound like, oh, it's a choice. But actually, when you use the word enslaved, it simply means that they didn't choose it. It was forced. That's the way Black scholars will use those kind of connotations, that it's not actually slavery, it is enslaved. People were enslaved. It was against their will. And from then on, that again, in the context of Africa, and this is for me, I feel fascinating sometimes when I think about history, because in the context of went hand in hand with slavery. As plantations were being developed, goods were being shipped around, colonies were being carved out, both in United States, in South America, and in the Caribbean. So colonies were emerging, European colonies alongside. But in the context of Africa, that is slightly different. We had slavery first and then colonization, in the sense that people came to a point where there's, of course, after the abolition, like, you know what, we have dealt with Africans through illegitimate trade, that is slavery, enslavement. Now it's time to deal with Africa through a legitimate trade. And that was what introduced colonization to Africa. They need to deal with Africa through a legitimate trade. So let's trade, but that trade was coming through colonization. And so that started in the context of Africa around 1850s, 1840s onward. That is when the colonization of African countries and people started in that sense. And again, that gives us a kind of a different language around polarization, colonial masters or colonial powers, and the colonized. So again, we see another language of polarization emerging from that context, that there is those who are colonized and there are the empires or the kingdoms that are colonizing them. And so that language continued. And again, as Christianity emerged, the evangelical movement emerged around that same period in the context of Africa. And one of the languages that was used by some missionaries, not all missionaries, was that, put it this way, the thought was that in order to plant Christianity in Africa, we have to level the plate. The Catholics employed a kind of an ideology of tabula rasa, which simply means wipe the slate clean. For evangelicals, it was like, there is no way the primal religions of Africa could be preparing Africans for the reception of the gospel. So the way missionaries were told to go in was that, again, start by leveling. You're starting from scratch, that nothing indigenous could be used in that sense. And so languages such as heathen, pagan, were used for Africans in that sense. And so again, that led to another language of polarization in terms of we have pagans, we have heathen that need to be saved, and we have the enlightened ones who are bringing that gospel to be saved, for them to be saved in that sense. And so the language of enlightenment come into that angle. Those who are not enlightened, those who are in the darkest areas of Africa, and then those who are enlightened from Europe in that sense. And so when we look at history, it's shaped a lot around polarization. And so how does that affect language? To move to the second part, how does that affect language? I think it's affected our language because even after colonization ended, slavery ended, I think now that a lot of, we talk about development that has emerged in terms of neo-colonization. And I think there is a language of dependency. And even now, the way we categorize our world is the developed world and the developing countries. The developed world and the developing countries. That's one of the languages that we use now, or at least being used. That initially we've used third world countries, which means there is a first world country or countries. So again, you see language polarizing us in terms of how we still see the other. And in that space again, because now there is a reversal in terms of migration, we now have a lot of people from the majority world coming. And so we now talk about economic migrants. We talk about refugees. We talk about asylum seekers. Now there's a distinction between asylum seekers and refugees. A refugee is someone who is fleeing and their refugee status has been granted. An asylum seeker is someone who is still waiting for their refugee status to be confirmed, as it were. But we see this language being used to describe the movement of people from the majority world. And when you look at all this language, whether it's migrant, economic migrant, asylum seekers, refugees, one thing they all have in common is that we actually don't see the potential of what this group of people can contribute. At least that's the way the society perceives them, because when you label someone an economic migrant, you're thinking they're coming to benefit on a system that already exists, on a welfare system. Another language we use is around, especially for students, international students, which means there are national students. And again, it's still around the language of you are receiving, you are not giving. And so language polarizes us. And to now look at the third aspect of that, church and polarization, those languages, the historical context that shapes that conversation, and how that has affected our language in terms of development, in terms of migration, has also actually affected how we describe churches that are now in Europe. We talk about migrant churches, which simply means that there are churches that are not migrants, and we measure it around European churches, whether that's Swedish or British. In the UK context, we talk about Black majority churches. And oftentimes when I talk to Black church leaders, sometimes when their churches are being described as Black majority churches, one of the questions we ask is, who gave us those names? Who gave us those names? Because we don't describe ourselves as a Black majority church. I've spoken to a lot of Black pastors who have said that. And so we have all these names, or ethnic minority churches or minority churches. And when you look at that language, when you talk about ethnic minority, sometimes it assumes that Europeans is not an ethnicity, whether that's British, German, Swedish, because you're saying ethnic minority, it means so is European identity in its various nationalities. Does that mean it's neutral? It's not an ethnicity? And so there is that. And again, in the UK context, another one we used to use is BME, Black Minority Ethnic. And again, that lumped together a whole lot of people group. And at times people will use that even to describe the church, a BAME church, that is a Black, Asian, or minority ethnic church, or a migrant church, or a diaspora church. That's another language that we tend to use in that sense, the language of scattering. Of course, that's biblical in that sense. But I think where we are as a church, it seems to me that we measure how we describe European churches, how we describe churches that have been planted from the majority world in the European context. They are measured in relation to how we, in relation to the neutrality of European identity. And it begs the question, which is, who is doing the naming? Who is the Adam that is naming the animals here? Just to use a biblical expression, Adam was given the task to do the naming. And so who's doing the naming? Who's doing the classification? Because sometimes, for example, I will be seen in the UK society as an economic migrant because I came from West Africa, from Nigeria. But actually, I see myself as a missionary migrant because I came to do mission. I didn't come because maybe I was suffering in Nigeria, or I had a good job. I had future mapped out. I was going to be a Bible translator in Nigeria. That was my plan, and to be a Pentecostal pastor alongside that, because I mastered the language of Greek and Hebrew. And I wanted to do that until there was a call to plant a church in the UK. So I don't situate my own narrative as an economic migrant or a political migrant or a refugee or asylum seeker. I see myself as a missionary migrant. And so the question this evening to us is, one is, who's doing the naming? And then the second thing is this: if society, if secular society in Europe is defining how we see other people, then it begs the question, what, as Christians, as church leaders, as leaders in various contexts, what is our role? What kind of theological language can help us to begin to see people we call migrant, and to go beyond just seeing them as people who have come to receive, and to change the language to a language that empowers, that sees them as contributing? And I think that's the challenge for us. How do we shift the language so that the language is not politicized, it's not economized, it's not used in development terms, but it's actually, how do we use a theological language that helps us to embrace the fact that yes, someone might have come as a refugee or asylum seeker, but they might have something that they can teach us. They might have something that they can inspire us about. And so that is very crucial in this conversation. And I think one of the things I think could really help us is just two sort of key doctrines in scripture. And one is the doctrine of creation, which affirms that we are all created in God's image. And I think for me, I find it very powerful that we are all created in God's image, which means that God created one human race. God didn't create races. That was something that was developed. That was a social construct that developed during the Enlightenment, of course, developed before the Enlightenment, but crystallized with the Enlightenment language in that sense. And so we are all equal in the eyes of God, whether some are seen as refugees or migrants or economic migrants. We are all equal before God. And so that speaks to our unity at the same time, because we are all image bearers of the Creator. That speaks to our unity, one human race. But at the same time, as much as that helps us in our understanding of unity so that we are not polarized, we can see each other as equal, there is also the doctrine of the incarnation. And the way I understand the doctrine of the incarnation is that there's a particularity about Jesus in the doctrine of the incarnation that I think speaks to ethnic difference, which needs to be understood, respected, and sort of embraced, because Jesus came as a Jewish male in a particular culture, in a particular context in the first century. And that speaks to the particularity of Jesus. And I think that doctrine of incarnation is still very powerful today to understand ethnic difference. And because I think if we don't understand the ethnic difference, we will give it a name that is not appropriate. We won't understand the value of it. We will not understand the contribution that could come from it. We will continue to perhaps see it in a kind of a old paradigm way of people are coming to receive, whereas actually some are coming to give, some are coming to contribute. In that sense. So I think it's important to look at those two doctrines and what they can offer us in terms of helping us to move away beyond polarization, whether in terms of language, in terms of history. They can also offer us reconciliation, which is a paradigm, again, that is important in this conversation in terms of the incarnation of Jesus, which leads ultimately to reconciliation. So I think that's very crucial and that's very, very important. But I'm going to leave it there so that we can have more conversation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Israel. You've given us a lot to think of, as has Nancy. Already some comments have shown up in the chat. It's time now to open it up to the floor and to the chat to ask our questions. If you see in the chat, some questions have been asked and partly answered, but I think I would like to go back to them anyway to see if there would be more of a robust conversation around it. Typing is sometimes limited. But Arto asked the questions. If you have a chance, could you expound more concerning the polarizing wording and suggest which alternative wordings we could use instead? And then, yeah, so we'll just leave that right now for Israel to answer. Is he gone? Okay.
Yes, he has gone. Well, he was already having some issues with his internet, so he might be just dropped out and maybe coming in again. He didn't say that he would be out. But...
Okay, so the two questions that are actually on here are for Israel. So then, does anyone have a question for Nancy or Jan Willem until Israel can come back in? Are there any questions from the floor? I mean, from what Jan Willem was saying, I'd like to hear from him, but also from Nancy on the case studies that you showed us, especially with the people who did not respond. Was that the right thing to do? should we be responding, and then how would you suggest we respond? Because I well imagine that the band didn't respond because they thought this was going to blow up even worse. But is that the best way to handle this?
I tend to believe it's not, but I do understand their decision because they didn't want to scapegoat the pastor that went to the media. So from the view of turning your other cheek, they chose not to respond. But that also kept the unjust frame going, and that even people who are willing to have a nuanced view didn't get a chance to adjust their view. And that's something that I regret, because I think there are a lot of people who are willing to have a nuanced view and who are willing to postpone their judgments to well, be in the radical middle instead of being on one of the sides. But if only the two sides are speaking up and no one in a nuanced view, well, I think that's yeah, a miss, a swing and a miss.
Well, it's one of the things, of course, of the whole polarization dynamics, that many times the people on the extremes, they are the loudest and they are always heard, and the media are taking those kind of things up, while the people in the middle, who don't want to be pulled into the extremes but just want to have peace and are looking for peace, they are never heard. And I think it's very important to see how we can let them speak. It's not that we put an obligation on them to come out and speak, because that doesn't help. But I think how can we help as churches provide good platforms, good safe places where people can really talk about it. I think, Nancy, you can say something about that also when it comes to politics.
Yes, of course. It's in those cases the pressure is really high when you have all the media and sometimes even political pressure on your organization, on an individual. So it's very difficult to take a decision. But from what I know from different cases is that you have to tell your own story. If you have the possibility to have a platform where you can tell your own story in your own words and in a very controlled communication, then it's better. Because exactly as you said, Jan-Willem, the media will really put you in a box and just they frame the debate. They are really just into the black and white kind of boxes. So I can refer to the case we had in France during the COVID period with the church of La Porte Ouverte de Mulhouse in the east of France. Maybe you remember the government and the media say that the whole COVID in France started in this church because they had, prior to all the regulation on the restriction, they had hosted a big event, and then of course fortunately some of the people were sick, and then of course the COVID spread, and they really had to tell their own story and to be really very intentional on that. So that's yes, I think that would be the advice. But it's very difficult. Right now at CNEF, we have a case on one of our members who is accused of conversion therapy. And so we have tried to keep the communication very controlled. And we have launched an internal inquiry on our member to assess the facts. And so you need to be very factual and not to jump into the hot question and try really to calm the debate. But that's very difficult when the pressure comes. And also, as you said, you can get also a lot of hatred on social media, and that's very difficult to take.
Thank you very much. Israel, you're back, and just in case your internet crashes again, we're going to ask a question really quick. We're going to go back to the questions that were put on screen that you actually answered, or partially answered at least, just to give you a chance to verbalize that and to add anything that your fingers couldn't type out fast enough. So the first question was if you could expound more concerning the polarizing wording and suggest what alternative wordings we could use instead.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the major thing is the way the language polarizes us is around, I suppose, how society defines. So just to give an example, an African missionary or an Asian missionary in Europe would probably be seen as society and even at the church sometimes as economic migrant. But a European missionary in other parts of the world would be seen as an expatriate. And that's interesting, isn't it? That oftentimes when we talk about Europeans in other parts, we don't usually use the word migrant for them. We either call them experts, expatriate. There are fancy words that we use to describe Europeans in the African context or Asian context. And so I always find it fascinating that the reversal is, we're not seen in those light as experts or anything. We are seen as more of people who are here at the mercy or wanting to receive something. But I think in terms of moving forward, in terms of language, I think in terms of the churches, it's one of the conversations we have had here in the UK. People have asked is why do churches always have to be labeled on racial lines? Why can't you, if a church is Pentecostal, why can't you just call it a Pentecostal church? If it's charismatic or evangelical, independent, why don't you go by their church tradition, just like you will have maybe Church of England or Baptist, Methodist, those sort of identities? Why not use similar categories? Because at times the blanket label doesn't really help. So some have advocated around that. And in terms of how people like to be described, definitely one of the words we are moving away from in the UK is BME, BAME, because it just doesn't say much about us in a lot of ways. So increasingly, people tend to prefer people of global majority heritage, people from the majority world. Another one that is still a bit controversial, but some people like it, is people of color. So I suppose whatever term we use, there will still be an issue with it. I do admit that. Words are always, language. But I suppose what is important is to find out how those churches or how people would like to be described or how to be called, so that whatever descriptive terms we come up with, it's not an imposition from the outside, but it's something that someone actually embrace and the way they describe themselves. So I think, but what that means is that requires a lot of hard work, that requires a lot of conversation, that requires a lot of collaboration, that requires a lot of patience. And at times, I know people are afraid to get it wrong, but you can only step out and ask these questions, and hope that you have a conversation in that sense. So I think it's important to, I suppose at the heart of it is the power dynamics. Where does this name, where did they come from? Who came up with the categorizations? For me, that's at the heart of the matter in that sense.
Thank you, Israel. We'll go to the second question right away. They were back to back. One question that came to my mind does not every statement include at least one implicit distinction, which means it uses a differentiation? Would you call this already a negative polarization?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, it's written right underneath. It's from Reinhardt.
Shall I try to explain? When I listen to you, Israel, it came to my mind whenever I make a statement saying A, this includes more or less, it's not B, it's not C, it's not D, and so on. And so every statement I make more or less makes this kind of distinction, differentiation. And would you call this already a polarization, which is negative, or is it just the way we segment?
No, thanks, Reinhard. So I think, yes, I suppose as human beings, we like to categorize things for the sake of communication and clarity, to know what we're talking about. So I think we cannot avoid that. But I think what I think is at the heart of this matter is, yes, we have to talk, we have to categorize, we have to use words. I suppose for me, what is crucial in this is how do we see, what language, what description can help us to see the missionary potential of migrants? What language can help us to be able to see that clearly? What language can empower us to appreciate the contribution? And for me, the one that helps myself and others that I know about is say, you know what, actually, I'm a missionary migrant. I'm not an economic migrant. That does help to empower, to shift the narrative in that sense. So if there are terms that we can come up with that can empower people as opposed to just leaving them at the mercy of other people, I think that will help. But we cannot avoid categorization, and not every word that we use will lead to polarization. But I think the word migrant is so heavily used in a sense that I think it orders a lot of people. And oftentimes the way it is used, particularly, I think it's the way it is used in the sense of, especially in some cases where migrants are actually demonized in that sense. Everyone blames a migrant. And then that's where it becomes a problem in that sense, if we can use it in a way that it is not demonized. After all, actually, to put it in a different light, when I read scriptures, Bible talks about our Christian identity as pilgrims. So when we actually look at it on the whole, every Christian is a migrant. I'm going to say that again because I think it's very important. When we look at the New Testament, when we look at scripture, the pilgrimage nature of Christian identity means that we are actually all migrants because our heavenly citizenship is not actually here.
Totally agree.
And so because of that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So totally agree on that. But wouldn't that be on the consequence that we need to relearn to get the negative impression that you probably hear on the word migrant, that we need to get this out of our context? So it's not the word in itself, it's about the context. Everyone is hearing of this. And then we find us suddenly in a very difficult situation in a postmodern world. Every one of us has a different context. Do you see definitely the point? Or to give you another example, when I hear the word migrant, my picture I have in mind is somebody who really needs help, and where I need to put my efforts in it to safeguard him or her and to help. So to avoid to use now in every circumstance the word migrant could be not an act of mercy, but exactly the opposite, meaning I do refuse to say, okay, I really accept that you need help and that I'm obliged to give you a home.
So if I understand what you're trying to say is that, is there a way we can move away from that? We can still use the words, but use it in a better way. Is that what you are saying?
Or in the original way, and really not to be naive to saying there's one meaning for one word, because we are living in so many different contexts.
So I think the problem is this. So for me, the word migrant in the European space, in the European context, is become heavily loaded. And it means, oftentimes when people use it, it means, yes, you need help. It means you have come, you are not, you are not British, or you are not German, or you are not Portuguese. You are a migrant in that sense. And sometimes even what is annoying is for those who are even second generation, even sometimes when we describe, we say second generation migrants, we still end up using that, even though they might see the identity that actually I am German now because I was born in Germany and I speak German. So I don't actually want to be called a migrant anymore because that was my parents that came. Now I am born here. So actually I'm German because I have German citizenship. And I think sometimes when we use the word second generation migrant or third generation migrant, I understand what we mean by that. But for actually those second and third generation, they don't like to be called those names because they don't see themselves anymore as migrants. They now actually see themselves as Europeans, whether they see themselves as Portuguese or whether Dutch or whether English and so on. They see themselves in those sort of light. In my own case, yes, I'm African, but I'm also British by marriage in that sense. So to just describe me as a migrant is not enough and actually doesn't say a lot about my identity. So at the heart of this question is identity in that sense and how people would like to be perceived rather than just a kind of a blanket language that orders them and that distort the identity or doesn't complexify their identity, make it very simple in a way that is dismissive or in a way that doesn't really help in that sense. So I think for me, that is what is at the heart of the matter.
I'm very mindful of the time. It's almost 7:30, but Arto had a question. He had his little yellow hand up a while back, and I want to honor that. So Arto, perhaps you can give the last question.
Thank you for the honor. Just my question is relating to this polarization that we are experiencing also in the evangelical field here in Finland. I've been kind of bothered by the thing that we have all these staunchly Finnish organizations and church movements involved in the Evangelical Alliance and being active. And we do have quite a few of these churches that are based on this immigrant background and status, and somehow I just see that we do need a strategy how to do a kind of an outreach to help them to feel part of this very, very Finnish evangelical community that we have here. And do you have any word of advice how we could help with this blending?
Thanks. So obviously each European country is very different. So I think what I'm going to say might not translate in some other areas or spaces. But I think you need to first work out what stage the churches you are describing, what stage they are. And then also you need to work out what stage the Finnish churches are. So what I mean by that is this, when people come to Europe, they go through a sort of a process. There is the surviving stage, which is where you're trying to work out this new context you are in, this new place where you find yourself. So that needs to be worked out where that particular church is there. And then the next stage is existing, where you begin to realize that actually I can make contribution here. I'm here for a reason. I'm existing for a particular reason in that sense. And then the third stage is when you actually begin to flourish in your identity and who you are in a European space. There's confidence. So there is surviving, existing, and flourishing. So that needs to be worked out what stage these churches are, because I think you might think some are at the surviving stage and actually be in a place where it might be totally different. They might be in an existing stage where they feel they can actually contribute and make a difference to the Finnish churches. And also from a European church perspective, I think there are 3 levels of how we can engage. One is our welcome, how we welcome people. And I think that's very crucial. Welcoming is a big subject. It includes hospitality, it includes friendship, it includes getting to know people and understand them. But also there is a next level of not just going beyond welcome to creating a sense of belonging. Oftentimes people mix up welcoming and belonging. Belonging is much more deeper and is very powerful. In that sense, so there is welcome, there is belonging, and there is a 3rd stage of where actually we begin to collaborate together. And so again, we have to work out how our strategy from welcome to belonging to collaboration to see how we can work. Well, let's welcome diaspora people first, but then let's sort of create a sense of belonging, that we are in this thing together in that sense. So that is also very crucial. And then the last stage of collaboration is, again, very key. So we need to work out where the diaspora or people from the majority, where they are. And then as European churches, we need to work out how we go on this journey, welcoming, belonging, collaboration.
We've come to the end of our time. Jan Willem had to leave for another meeting, but Nancy and Israel, we recognize without a doubt that this was not a 15-minute presentation done by you, that much work went into this and much thought, and we're very grateful for what you have provided for us and the insight that you've given us. I feel like we could have probably sat here for another hour or more. This conversation, I feel, needs to go on as we think of the different nuances and what's happening in the European society. It would be very good to keep in touch and to hear further, not just from our speakers who did an amazing job, but from one another, as we all live in different contexts, and yet we all call ourselves European. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us. I'd like to remind you, or tell you perhaps for the first time, on December 13, we have our next EEA Hope Forum, and you are all invited. We will release the topic to you in the next several weeks, but just put that on your calendar. And again, feel free to use this with the EEA family and with churches and pastors and leaders. Some of these conversations, like the one today, would have been very helpful for lots of pastors who are trying to maneuver these issues both pastorally and even legally. So please open this up. Feel free to do that. And if you have any questions, please get a hold of either the Bonn office or Jan and I, and we would love to connect more and just to share more thoughts. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night, or if you're in the UK and Portugal, a great rest of the afternoon.